Welcome to the Corporate Treasury 101 podcast. Today we receive Koen de Smet. Koen is a director in a major consulting company and a specialist of treasury transformation projects. It was very important for Hussam and I to invite an expert in order to discuss the topic of today. In this episode, we talk about systems in treasury. Yes, what does that even mean, you may think? Well, we have the answers for you right here in this episode. Today, expect to learn what is a treasury system, why do corporations need a treasury systems, what can be done in such a tool. We of course cover the main ones, treasury management systems that Hussam and I already talked about in this podcast, payment hubs, but also trade finance systems, and all kinds of specialized tools for very specific treasury related tasks. Last but not least, we discuss integration of such systems and how to implement them. Koen really is impressive. He knows a lot about treasury in general, but also and obviously about systems, and it was a real pleasure to interview him today. Before we get into this fascinating episode, some small kind reminders. We published an ebook. If you were dreaming of finding a book explaining the ABCs of corporate treasury, well, do not search anymore. We got you covered. Head to the link in the description to download it, and the best part, it is completely free. Last but not least, if you like the podcast, or if you want to support us, or if you do not want to miss any of the episodes in the future, or all of the above, well, subscribe to the podcast. Oh, and you can give us a good rating in the meantime. That makes Hussam and I very happy. And actually, it helps the podcast to be found more easily by other treasury aficionados. With all that being said, please welcome Koen. Koen, welcome to the podcast. Super happy to have you here.
Thank you, Guillaume. Thank you. Also happy to be here.
It's gonna be very exciting. So maybe before we get into the topic, can you quickly introduce yourself for the people who might not know you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Koen de Smet. I'm part of a treasury advisory team of a Big Four consulting firm. I'm a director and I'm specialized, as I mentioned, in treasury advisory, mainly for corporate treasuries.
Okay.
And within that, I'm actually more helping corporates to transform their treasury organizations with specialization in treasury technology.
Awesome, which is spot on because so we talked about a lot of topics on this podcast already, but we never talked about systems, and I think you're the perfect person for that. Can you, to begin with, what's a system actually? When we talk, of course, of the financial world and in a corporation, what's a system?
Well, a system is basically first of all, a repository of capturing transactions, and transactions could mean different. The classical AP and AR invoices, basically, going until payroll records. But in treasury, we of course talk about other type of transactions that are captured in systems.
Okay, so AP and AR, just like, let's say people do not have any knowledge of what this could be. What are those terms exactly?
Well, accounts payables, accounts receivables, everybody must have received an invoice in his or her life. That is typically captured in an ERP. I use that as a kind of a example of why systems are used in, let's say, corporate worlds. And for treasury specifically, a system is then used to capture treasury-related transactions and data points as a first element, and secondly, to enable the digitization or digitalization of workflows within a system.
Okay, so digitalization is a super interesting topic. Why, to begin with, why is it important to capture those transactions? What's beneath that?
Well, as an example, some of the corporate treasuries that we work with have, let's say, hundreds of bank accounts, first of all.
Okay.
So imagine that you are, as an individual person, having, one or two bank accounts at maybe one maximum two banks. You can go to two electronic banking systems and you can capture your account information there. If you're a corporate treasury, you basically have plus 100, plus 1,000 some of the corporates' bank accounts. So ideally, you capture that all in one system and you don't have to go to, 20 different platforms to capture your bank account, bank statement information as a first element.
Okay. And therefore, you can capture correctly what's happening on those bank accounts and help you with driving your treasury.
Exactly. A second element, for example, is a function of corporate treasury, which I'm sure you have covered already, is financial risk management, right?
Yes, it's okay. This one we have. Whew.
So
yeah, okay. And so the system, but we're gonna come to financial risk management. The second point you mentioned was digitization. Obviously, that speaks by itself, right? A lot of corporations try to digitize their processes and so on. Why do you want to do so in finance and more precisely in treasury?
Why you need digitization in treasury?
Yes.
Well, just because of the vast majority of transactions that the treasury team is dealing with, which is typically quite large amounts of data and transactions to be dealt with, which is almost impossible or is very error prone and high risk if you do that offline, i.e. in an Excel. Secondly, a treasury function is typically a lean and mean function, which is not staff. Therefore, being able to kind of automate some of these elements in the system is essential to be able to truly act as a value add function.
Interesting. Okay, so you'd rather have a system doing a lot of repetitive operations, I guess, rather than having somebody or numerous people doing it by themselves.
Exactly, yes. Yeah. So to a certain extent, automate what you can automate to avoid somebody manually having to do a repetitive action that essentially can be automated or semi-automated in a workflow or a tool.
Okay. And I imagine the bigger the company, the bigger the amount of bank accounts, as you mentioned earlier, so the more relevant becomes the systems in Treasury.
Exactly, yeah. There is, that's what you see also with the, let's say, companies that are fast growing, that they've outgrown almost their treasury function. That their treasury function is still operating as a, let's say, a smaller or medium-sized company, that suddenly then requires to catch up to be able to catch up with the company's complexity as such as well.
Okay. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned earlier the financial risk as well. So I know I've read on LinkedIn, sometimes people do not call it a treasury management system, but a treasury risk management system. What's the dimension of the financial risk here in the system? How does it help? So it will capture the transactions, right? When you do your hedges, for instance, but what else? What's in there?
Yeah, so it starts, of course, with exposure management, right? So ultimately, if you want to hedge, you need to understand what your exposures are, and typically, exposures are FX exposures, so foreign exchange, that are arising from the balance sheet or off the balance sheet. Secondly, you have if you have floating rate debt, you basically have interest rate risk.
Yes,
that requires to be hedged, and some companies, depends on the business, of course, also have commodity risk, and those are your exposures as a number one. Secondly, and then when you have exposures and you have a hedging strategy that defines that you want to protect yourself against market volatility, you would hedge those, and capturing those hedges and operating those trades would happen in a treasury management system.
Awesome. So among all the terms you just mentioned, we covered most of them in the podcast. I just like to come back on one. You said exposure on and off balance sheets. Can you quickly walk us through that? What does that mean?
Yeah, so basically on balance sheet, coming back to my very earlier point around AP and AR.
Yes.
So that means as soon as you book an invoice, it's on your balance sheet, right? That means that it is an exposure that is out there that can be hedged. Off balance sheet means a forecast of an expected, let's say, future sale or receipt.
Okay.
We see, for example, companies in project-related businesses doing a lot of cash flow hedging, which is typically off balance sheet.
Okay, so typically what you're sure is going to happen will be on balance. I mean, in an ideal world where everything happens as it should, on balance sheet would mean it's an invoice that has been issued, so it will happen. And off balance sheet will be more, it's something that we predict, foresee, but it's not, I mean, the amount may vary. That's
exactly. There's more uncertainty around that. So typically you would see companies not 100% hedging their exposure, but rather taking a bit more a prudent approach there.
Okay, or gamble them out of it and hope for the better on the market. That's also an option, I guess. Okay.
Yeah.
Anything else in the role of systems in Treasury? Because that was going to be one of my questions, but I feel we covered it with the reconciliation, recording of the transactions, the financial risk aspect of it. Anything else?
It's of course what I briefly touched upon as well, your funding and investments, right? So some companies have a shortage in cash, some have excess in cash. So
Absolutely.
that means you need to be able to track your loans, your debt issuance, your investments that you put at banks, your money market funds.
Okay.
That is all captured in treasury management systems. Lastly, there's also cash management. So basically, if you have those 1,000 bank accounts, which are then typically part of some sort of a pooling structure that needs to be tracked accordingly in a treasury management system.
Yeah.
And then you, of course, have your treasury accounting, right? So once you've captured all those transactions, you need to account for them.
Yes.
And that's then also operated by the treasury management system that in most cases serves as a sub-ledger to the general ledger to basically create the accounting entries and typically interface them to an ERP back again as well.
Okay, so cool. Those are a lot of fancy words. I love it. So that's really clear. Just to summarize this, I would say that the system is just used to record and track everything, so you can drive your financial decisions in the most efficient way. That's good. Okay. And regarding the treasury accounting, that's for some reasons because I don't really like it. Something we didn't cover in the podcast yet. But so what is happening in here? So sub-ledger, general ledger. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Let me try to explain that. So
no pressure.
If you have a let's say a forward, an FX forward, right? That means I'm buying and selling a currency against another currency at a future date, right?
Yes.
That means that trade will, of course, requires to be tracked in your accounting. So, for example, at month end, you would do typically a mark to market, right, to understand what's the value of my forward right now today.
So you compare it to the rate that are currently on the market against the one you contracted it at.
Exactly. Without going into the details as to how to do that, that means that let's say unrealized profit and loss that trade will bear has to be booked, and that gets booked at month end, typically by a treasury management system. And that's why I'm saying a sub ledger, because it only captures the treasury related accounting entries within its system, and it will then interface those to the general ledger where everything else is captured, your balance sheet, your P&L, and so forth. That is then tracked there accordingly.
Super clear. Thanks a lot. Sorry, that was a bit of an unplanned question, but super clear. And the general ledger will be at the ERP level, I imagine, or something like that.
Yes, that is typically the case.
Super clear. Does every company have a treasury-related system, or as of when do we have a treasury system?
Well, there's no golden rule as to when you should get a treasury management system in terms of, for example, total turnover of a company, right? Let's say as of 1 billion, you should get a system. There's no such rule as that.
Okay.
I think you need to look at your complexity in which you operate.
Yeah.
And then that will define basically what are my broader treasury requirements or needs. And then that will then define whether you need a system or not, right? And it will also depend again on the volume of transactions and so forth.
Okay.
To use an example, if you have a company that purely operates within, let's say, a single country, just as an example, taking Belgium, and purely has transactions within Belgium, has no foreign exchange risk, has only a handful of bank accounts, a treasury management system might be overkill. However, if a company starts to grow and starts to export and import from various countries and therefore has foreign exchange risk, has bank accounts all over the world, then it becomes suddenly unmanageable to do that outside of a system. And that would be then, when the company would start requiring a system to do things properly, efficiently, and without reducing risk.
Okay. So it's not that much about the size of the company, but more the complexity of its financial transaction operations. However, we mentioned as of when you start to have a lot of transactions and a lot of bank accounts, I guess the bigger the company, the higher the amount of those, right? So it can also be linked to that. But it's more, first criteria is more complexity of the treasury landscape than the actual assets. Okay, very interesting. And is there a moment where it becomes critical? So you are in multiple countries, sorry. You have FX hedges or FX exposure, at least, that you might want to hedge. You have bank accounts throughout the world, different currencies, loans, as you mentioned, with variable interest rates and so on. There it becomes critical to have a treasury management system.
Yeah, I mean, that's every company, of course, to decide that amongst themselves. I think if indeed if your company starts to outgrow your supporting functions, then your supporting functions probably need to grow with you. Mm-hmm. And that is, again, there's no kind of left or right answer here. It's more the companies to be evaluated themselves. You can basically increase your team with 10 FTEs and still do it offline.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that none of those 10 FTEs will ever make a mistake. While they can still make a mistake in the treasury management system, it will be much more controlled, much more centralized, and so forth. So that, I think, is each company to define it themselves. But typically, the answer is pretty obvious.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So not depending on the risk appetite here, but how far they want to automate the processes and how digital they want their landscape to be. Yeah. Very clear. Just a technical question on the treasury management system. Systems related to treasury. How do they work exactly? Is it a license? Most of the people know about SAP, right, and Oracle. But when it comes to systems in treasury, are we talking about software as a service? Are we talking about licenses now? How does it work exactly? What's the process?
So similar to other systems, I think what we are seeing in the market is a very big shift towards SaaS, and let me try to spell it in full. So that's software as a service, and SaaS applications is more and more, let's say, the way to go. So in fact, what you can get is a treasury management system. You could either, let's say, install what they call on-premise, which is a bit what we saw 10, 15 years ago, where most corporates were basically installing that service on their own server sites, right?
Okay.
Similar to how ERPs were typically done. Now we are seeing a shift towards, and those are, let's say, option 2 and 3, towards private cloud. That means, that is often a term that is used interchangeably with SaaS, but that's actually not correct. So private cloud is where a system vendor will host the application on their server sites, but you basically have your own private application, let's say, at that vendor, your own private database. Whereas with SaaS, you're basically are accessing a software and a solution that is also accessed by other corporates. Everybody has, of course, his or her part, or his part of the database, but it's all managed by the vendor. And the big difference is system upgrades. In a SaaS application, an upgrade is done on the fly, basically over the weekend. In all the two other options I mentioned, on-premise or private cloud, that is done as in, let's say, a mini project that requires specific handling because of the nature of that deployment or installation.
So you're now even anticipating my questions. But so why would anybody go for the private cloud solution then? If you need every time to mobilize some resources in order to do this mini project, rather than having the software company just updating it over the weekend, why would you choose a private cloud nonetheless?
There is some vendors and applications that basically are not yet offered as a SaaS solution. That's number one. Basically, you don't have the choice. But I think the most important difference is the configuration and customization ability of SaaS applications. There's a certain limit to that because you're all using, the same software, the same functions, and not everybody can kind of get all their wishes in the system and customize certain things or workflows, because they're also used by other corporations, let's say. In a private cloud and an on-premise solution, you have much more flexibility there, where you can basically get your own custom solutions in the system.
Awesome. So it's about having a standard product that everybody use the same version of, or having it customized for. Is it something corporations seek a lot, like having something very tailored for the treasury function because of the complexity of it? Or what's the state of the market on that?
Again, there's a big evolution been done there, that if you 15 years talk to a corporation, they will typically come with their requirements and kind of force fit the system of the vendor to meet those requirements and specific needs. And therefore, you would typically have more customizations, because, you know, there is a certain process that needs to be installed in a system, and it's not standard, and it requires coding changes of the software. Okay. What we are seeing today is that a lot of corporations are very hesitant to get customizations in the solutions, because that means if you do an upgrade later on, it becomes more there's more workload, more cumbersome. Exactly, that was the word I was looking for. So that I think is a key thing, and that's what we are seeing, that the more and more standard solutions are basically adopted by corporations that are offered by the vendor, and processes are rather changed than trying to change systems. A second element is that, and that's mainly the bigger corporations, then if they have a specific need or requirement, they will try to sit together, let's say strategically with the vendor, to get this into the core product. So basically, get the requirement in the core product, and then it's part of the offering for everybody, which is, I think, the better way to go for it. Okay.
So if you have negotiation strength, power, however we call it, enough as a big, massive corporation, you can even influence how the software is done.
That's one, of course, your weight, but secondly, it's also the relevance of a certain requirement for other corporations. If the vendor sees value in this, they will for sure look into that to add to their core product.
Which would make sense. Okay, and so I'm entering into the technicalities a bit, but it's super interesting. Would the solution not be to add some options into the standard products, and you just unlock those parts of the SaaS if you pay more, or is that not something doable? So big corporations might actually just go to their vendor and ask for an additional option, module configuration whatsoever that will be implemented into a standard offering of this vendor. If you have a SaaS, so something not a private cloud, could the company say, okay, everything is on SaaS, but if you want some customization, we have them accessible in an optional module, for instance, and you can just decide to activate them or not. Is that something that is possible, or am I completely out of?
Not to my knowledge, but it's actually a good question. So you could then, look into, I'm not going to call it workaround solutions, but add-ons to your treasury management system, right? So basically, for example, have an RPA tool that kind of pulls data in and out your system to achieve the same, as an example, so robotics process automation. But I think more importantly is there's user groups, right, of vendors that are meeting annually, biannually. Requirements are being shared. I think sitting at the table together with your vendor on a strategic manner, to kind of talk through your needs, think through together, and ultimately get things on the roadmap to develop. To get developed is, I think, the better way to go for this. But of course, speed of execution is sometimes important. Therefore, workarounds, as I mentioned in the beginning of my answer, are sometimes opted for in the beginning.
Okay, super clear. That's good. The vendors are listening to their actual user and implement changes on the go. Very clear. What are the different types of systems we can find in the treasury landscape typically? So not talking about the ERP anymore, but really treasury functions.
The functions of a treasury management system, or the systems themselves?
So the different systems. I would like to make a little dive in the treasury management system a little bit down for the episode, but still remaining high level. Because we can imagine there are as many systems as functions in treasury now. You have the TMS, obviously, we covered this one. what are the other ones, other systems we can find?
Sure. So we spoke about the treasury management system, which I'm always calling the kind of core treasury system or solution. So that is kind of basically the backbone, almost as you will, or the radar center behind your treasury team. Then you have some, let's say, applications that typically interact with your treasury management system, but also with other tools in the organization, which we could call specialist applications. A big one within that is a payment factory solution, also sometimes called the bank connectivity hub, which is basically a bank agnostic or multi-bank platform that has as a main function to process payments and to retrieve account information, so bank statements, being at end of day, intraday, and kind of distributing that to the relevant system. So that is, I think, two core applications within what we see in many treasury functions that have those tools. Sometimes they're part of one solution, sometimes they're two separate solutions.
That was going to be my question, because you mentioned it when describing the functions of the TMS. You especially talked about this retrieving the information from the bank account. But now, so the payment hub does that in a more efficient manner, more streamlined.
Yeah, treasury management systems have basic functionality, basically to always, visualize that information, right, in a cash position worksheet or what have you. And they somehow also have the necessary bank connectivity to, even do payments and retrieve bank statement information. But and some have really advanced functions within that. But we see also a lot of specialist players there in that domain that offer just a distinct solution to do that. And that solution then also, and that's an important nuance, operates and processes company-wide payments, such as, again, our AP, payroll, so large volumes of transactions that are all channeled through a single solution to the banks.
Okay, so it's not only the treasury transactions anymore, but operating the whole. So this payment hub will be linked also to the ERP you mentioned earlier that is using, which is aggregating this API.
ERP or ERPs or other, let's say, source solutions that produce payments. Think about, typical payroll solutions such as there's many out there. But also, for example, TNL,
TNL. Is that
expense tools, for example, would also produce payments to reimburse the employees and all those things. So there's many, kind of interfacing tools. With a payment factory or bank connectivity hub, and then you have all sorts of other specialist treasury tools that are sometimes called satellite applications, surrounding applications that are basically each have their own purpose. And if you want, I can name a few.
Domain, maybe not name of systems, but indeed domain. So in my mind, because we had an interview with the amazing Ellen Lowers on this podcast, who talked about trade finance, and I imagine there will be trade finance visualized tools, for instance. What else will be out there?
Yeah, so indeed, trade finance, again, multi-bank platforms there, but also trade execution platforms. So if you, again, thinking about the beginning of our conversations, you have FX, foreign exchange hedges that you're doing. You basically need to do them in the market, right? And typically those are done over the counter. That means directly with a bank.
Yes.
And most corporations, again, 30 years ago, that would have been done over the phone. Now that is done in a platform where you basically ask a price for your trade to multiple banks, and that is done in a trade execution platform.
Awesome. So this trade execution platform will be linked to a numerous amount of banks. You will ask for a quote, and all the banks bid for this specific quote. Is the process fully automated then on the bank side as well, or is it only for the corporate?
It is. So what you would see that indeed almost all big banks are signed up to those platforms, and they also have their, let's say, machines linked to those platforms, so that liquid trades, plain vanilla trades, just basically get priced automatically. Whereas very distinct trades, for example, in exotic currencies or large amounts, would then be rule-based, be routed to a trader that will have to price it at the bank itself.
Also, go ahead. So the advantage of this tool will be to, again, as for the TMS, a little bit eliminate the manual, potentially highly risked workload, because human can make errors where machines tend to do a little bit less, not zero, but less. So here again, the objective is to get off this over-the-counter aspect and more just automate the deal of that.
The trades will still be done over the counter. That's just the nature of the way they're executed, but it's more indeed the fact that you do it all in a platform. So imagine you're doing 10 FX trades per day. Some corporations 100. If you do that over the phone with your trader at the bank, the risk of making an issue or an error or misunderstanding each other in terms of the price is very high, right? So
indeed. Never understood those pairs, currencies, rates, and numbers, but okay, makes sense. Okay.
There's a few other platforms, confirmation platforms to confirm those same trades, market data providers, and so forth and so forth. So there's a whole suite of applications, and that's what I wanted to kind of mention on this one as well, is that in the past, treasury management systems would try to have a very broad scope and try to almost get everything in one solution. Now we are seeing a trend towards trying to exploit the strengths of solutions. So basically, focus on what you're good at and rather work on a seamless interface with a specialist solution that is also focusing on what they're good at.
Interesting. So that would also mean more, as you call them, satellite systems, applications. So you multiply the cost as well, I imagine, because, as good as people in Treasury may be, they do not do things for free, right? So if you install all those satellite applications, the cost is higher, but it's still more interesting than having human people do it or having a manual process.
There is a cost indeed associated to that, and it's again all about cost benefits, where what is your need. There's a number of, let's say, basic essentials. So everybody will want to have market data in the system, right? Or you cannot account for your trades. And typically those are not also at the highest cost, I would say. But every corporation needs to make the benefits case or business case themselves, of course, for going for a solution or not.
Okay. And so again, going back to what you said earlier, it will depend on the complexity. If you do one trade per week, foreign exchange, so that would justify one of those platforms you just talked about. It's maybe not worth to implement a digital platform, but if you do 100 per day, then it becomes relevant. Whereas, I don't know, your bank account management tool might be less relevant because you don't have that many whatsoever.
Yeah.
Throughout the systems, I feel that there is a lot of interactivity, interdependency between the different systems. The FX trading platforms need to capture correctly the exposure, right? That is consolidated into the TMS. The AP and AR that are in the ERP are linked to the TMS and so on. How is this whole landscape integrated between each other? Is it a direct connection? How does it work?
Yeah, so let's say in the middle, you have your treasury management system, right? That is then getting interfaces, again, depends on the need to those other solutions.
Okay.
And those are typically not standalone solutions. And again, it depends on the need, right? You could have a solution, let's say, to capture a money market fund transaction, but you only do a handful per month. Then you probably don't need an interface. You could do it manually. Okay. But if you have that done daily and high frequency, you probably would require an interface to do it efficiently, or somebody essentially needs to key over data from system to system every day. So again, that depends on the need, but what we see is that those solutions are normally interfaced with each other using various technologies. Yeah.
Okay. Very interesting. We covered most of the functionalities of the TMS, I feel. What we like to ask with Sam on this podcast is what makes a successful blah, blah, blah. I feel what makes a successful TMS isn't really relevant, but can you walk us through what would a best-in-class treasury department look like, or in terms of TMS and payment hub, because those are the two main you mentioned. what does it look like? Like a TMS that will execute all the treasury functions, completely linked to the other interfaces and applications you may have, the payment hub taking care of all the payments, completely running wild here and making assumptions. But what does it look like in a best-in-class treasury department?
So to me, best in class, there is no single rule for that to say this is best in class. First of all, I think what it should do is as I mentioned, the treasury team is typically a lean team, right? So that means and highly qualified people. Typically, what I think would be then a pity is that the vast majority of your team or people are spending 90% of their time to kind of process 90% of the transactions and only have 10% of their time available or no percent of their time available to analyze data, to optimize strategies, to provide value insights for the organization. So I think it is, in fact, people should only spend 10% of their time on 90% of the transactions and 90% of their time on 10% plus the value add function that a treasury should have.
Yeah.
That I think is the right balance to find. And of course, there is complexities that are always divert a bit from this kind of a rule, not scientifically I would say underpinned, but it is more like an evaluation that a company should make, right? Is my team of 10 people purely processing transactions because my processes are not automated, requires a lot of manual intervention, then you would probably are not best in class for your organization. Then something can be done to optimize this, and people could be freed up to do other things that are, let's say, more value add.
Awesome. That's fascinating. I can't stop myself from thinking about the conversation we had with Mike. And it's interesting that talking about TMS, it comes back to people. What the best in class, or however we may call it, treasury department look like is when people actually focus on bringing value because the systems do the repetitive task for them. Super interesting. Anything else you would like to mention about TMS? I have a little last section I would like to touch upon, but anything else we forgot to touch upon and that may be relevant for the treasury management system, payment hub? I think we didn't mention cash flow forecasting. I imagine there will be some tools for that as well. It's one of the main functions.
Yeah, that's really been an interesting one to indeed finalize this section. There's cash flow forecasting, which is, if you look at what is on top of mind of treasurers for the past 5-10 years, you would always see cash flow forecasting in the top 3.
Okay.
Of course, that has spikes when crises are around the corner or wherever we are in a crisis. For example, 2008, COVID-19, and now recently, luring recession, let's say. People are again trying to, looking into cash flow forecasting because, strangely enough, not a lot of corporate treasuries are doing this well, while, cash is basically what is, one of the key elements of a treasury management system or team, I would say, or processes. So indeed, for cash flow forecasting, there is also specialist applications. A lot of corporations are still doing it in Excel. And the reason for that is that, cash flow forecasting will require data, not only that is residing in your treasury management system, but also from other applications in the organizations, plus will require manual input from, business teams within the organization. And that's why a cash flow forecasting tool is often a separate tool that is then also interfacing data from large amounts of data from ERPs that are not really meant to be in a treasury management system. For example, there's no value in capturing all your accounts receivables, accounts payables that basically are required for a cash flow forecasting in a treasury management system. Therefore, they are separate, and they also are more focused on, dashboarding and BI tool applications.
Awesome. I will imagine that, again, TMS could ensure the basic function of cash flow forecasting, but as soon as you want some more detailed, more integrated, more precise tool, you need to go for a specialized
and some treasury management systems do it quite well. My only point is the treasury management system the right tool to pull in all this data that kind of give you the insights that you want in a cash flow forecasting solution.
Okay. Awesome. Mentioning those corporations that might not be on the latest trend of cash flow forecasting is a perfect transition for the next section. How do you integrate all those? So we could talk about cash flow forecasting too, but how do you integrate and implement such systems into a company or treasury department? How does it work?
Yeah, so it starts, of course, with baselining what you need, and have to make sure that you have a common understanding and ground for what you require. So the way that this is normally approached is you would do a very detailed description on as is, not with the idea to kind of replicate your current state processes, because if you need a new system or you need a system, your current state processes are probably not the best in class, right? But really with the purpose to understand the scope and complexity that you're dealing with, and also forward-looking your future complexity, right? So you could have a view on today, but if your company try to enter new markets and that will introduce new financial risk, you might have new requirements coming from there. So it's also good to look a bit further out. So it's basically defining your current state with the focus on scope and complexity, but then looking at, target state, where do we want to go as an organization with my processes and what are my requirements thereof. And then once you've that all defined and clear, it would be to do an RFP or a request for proposal with the relevant parties for you. And those are not all the same for all corporations, because you have, with many software solutions, a lot of applications out there. And then it's the typical phase of a system implementation, the design, the build phase, the testing phase, and then ultimately going live. All of that, of course, needs to be well understood how that will work when you start such projects. So I think road mapping is very important to be able to understand where you want to go to, which milestones you want to achieve. Otherwise, you basically run a bit in the dark. And that's tricky, because then you don't see results.
Absolutely.
And so forth, yeah.
That's a lot of super interesting information. If I may summarize it, so what you want to begin with actually is assessing the current state of your treasury landscape and potentially broader financial and company landscape in general. Okay, what is done now? What do we need to bear in mind when we implement the system or select the system to the RFP that you mentioned right after? But also properly capture where we want to go. Then you will have the RFP process, which means you give away or you announce your requirements to different system vendors, and the system vendors pitch and bid for the different requirements you are looking for. Then you start the implementation, and you mentioned testing phase. That's an interesting one. So what's the testing phase? You make sure the vendor is actually complying with what he said in the RFP? What is it?
So once you shared your requirements, right, and you've gone through detailed design about your processes with the system vendor will go off and configure this in the system. In some cases, you might need to support that configuration or complete it along with the vendor's help or with the system integrator. And then you start a testing phase, which means your end users running basically the to-be processes in the system and testing it. And that could mean, for example, entering an FX transaction, trying to confirm it, try to settle it, import bank statements, do your cash positioning. So basically your day-to-day treasury functions that you're testing in your new solution, ideally using real production data to see whether it properly functions. And then once everybody happy, you sign off in a user acceptance testing phase, and then that is typically the trigger to go live with your new system.
Awesome. User acceptance testing. Here you mean, okay, once we've gone through that period of, it's a question, but my understanding is once you've gone through that period of testing, everything is working as it was meant to, the users accept it. And so then the go live can occur. That's the idea.
Exactly. So all users have executed successfully all their test cases.
Mm-hmm.
There is no defect anymore that is deemed to be a showstopper, and that always requires a discussion for some cases. And then everybody signs off that yes, we are comfortable that we can go live with our new solution, and that's what the last phase, user acceptance testing, is for.
Awesome.
Or one of the last phases, yeah. There's also others which we can dive into if you want to.
So that was going to be my question. So you mentioned go live. So you do the user acceptance test. Let's call it UAT for the aficionados of Treasury here. You have your go live, which means okay. Now you mentioned also production. Can you quickly?
Yeah. So what a lot of companies do after the user acceptance testing is parallel testing. That means replicating your day-to-day processes, transactions that are done in real life, right, in the Treasury department in your system to see if you get the same results or if you can explain differences. So that is done over a period of, and it all depends, 2 to 4 weeks, but it could also be 2 to 3 months for some corporations. Depends how long you need to be comfortable. That is, I think, a phase that is almost always done in a implementation to be 100% comfortable, along with penny testing. And I'm throwing in a new term again. That means doing a $1 trade, for example, on your trade execution platform to see whether it truly functions as it should. So it's a real transaction, basically. So that's why it's called a penny trade.
Awesome. And so production will be you get out of the test environment and you enter into the real life environment.
In the real life environment, exactly. That's how it often is referred to as production environment. Yeah.
Awesome. And yeah, obviously I have a lot of questions on this. That's just super interesting. So parallel testing. You mentioned earlier when I asked about how do you know if the Treasury landscape needs to buy this system or start having a system for specific functions. When you do this parallel testing, will there be such a thing as, okay, we made a business case for this system. It will make sense because from a quantitative and qualitative aspect. So it will make us savings, make us win time, decrease the risk. When you do this parallel testing or at any moment of the implementation, do you say, okay, here is what we talked about when we were making the as-is and the to-be landscape. Here we are winning money because look, the system is doing it better than when we are doing it ourselves. Is there such a thing?
Yeah, that's actually a good point. So what we see often as well is Treasury organizations trying to typically also have performance indicators, KPIs, key performance indicators.
Yes.
That you try to also get some sort of reporting out of your solution so that you can, for example, see the average processing time or the number of errors that occurred, for example, in a payment factory. Let's say I do 100,000 transactions per year and only 2,000 got rejected. That means quite a high success rate, right? What is the ambition that we want to go for? Are we seeing a positive trend over the years or not? That's all very valuable insights that you can get out of your system purely from a processing perspective alone.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so that's something that happens. And once you have the go live, you mentioned there is potentially other phases as well, but I was interested into, okay, the system is live, nothing's happening anymore then? Or is there like a follow-up? Do we say, okay, we've implemented this, but in the 1 month, 2 month period, we started to have this bug or this issue? Is there in the implementation period a phase where you say, I don't know, a hypercare type of thing?
Yeah, there is. So you go live and you typically then have hypercare. As it says it in the word almost, it's a dedicated care for after go live. That means you get access to, let's say, the consultants of your integrator or the consultants of the Treasury vendor that you can speak to directly in case an issue occurs that, it can be handled quickly and you don't need to rely purely on the, let's say, standard or customer support. There's also, again, linking it back to the road mapping thing I said earlier, a lot of system implementations happen in phases where companies try to go live with a certain scope of functionality initially, and then have a phase 2 where they try to expand it.
Okay.
And there, your roadmap is important, that you make sure you truly execute on your phase 2, because otherwise you could be living with a system that you think is not good, but actually is good, but you just never kind of push through your phase 2 and implemented your additional functionalities. So that's why a roadmap and a clear plan is very important.
Super interesting. Okay, so the functions of a treasury system will be so heavy that you cannot implement, or you likely cannot implement everything in one go. You need to have different phases for different functionalities.
You can, but you can, of course. It all depends on the complexity again.
Okay.
Some do it in one shot, but I've seen a lot of companies always have some sort of an optimization phase where they try to implement additional functionalities, for example, on the reporting side, advanced risk reporting, to get more out of the treasury management system. And I think that is always an important phase, because that's when you truly start, increasing the value and the return on investment of your solution.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. As per our conversation, I guess it's a bit hard to say, but I want to ask this question nonetheless. I guess it depends on the complexity, the size of the company, the type of system you implement, but how long does it typically take to implement a system? What timeline are we talking about here?
I think it can be done as fast as, I've seen it 3 to 6 months, but I've also seen implementations from 12 to 18 months and even longer.
Okay.
So, the SaaS solutions are typically quicker to implement because of, less ability to configure the system from scratch. It's not such a toolbox. It's a pre-configured database. For more complexer solutions, it takes normally longer, and the reason is the complexity of the solution and the functionality. More importantly, the complexity of the functionality that needs to be configured, but also it typically serves a larger user base.
Yeah.
And there's a whole element of change management, training, which requires a lot of throughput time to get into the organization. You cannot do that software installation overnight and expect the people to run with it the next day.
Yeah, no, that's a very fair point. And so, talking about that, what's the lifetime of such product? Because 3 to 6 months and up until 12 to 18 months to implement, then what? Is it something that you're gonna change like your socks, or are you gonna have to live with this system for a couple of years, 10 years? What are we talking about there?
Well, you would typically stay with it like for 10 years, right? Or even longer, right?
Okay.
If you're happy with the solution and it does what you do, then why changing it, right? If it serves your needs. You see corporations changing or looking to change when it doesn't anymore serve their needs. And I think what is important there, and talking a bit against my own shop, is that you then engage with your vendor, right, to kind of truly explain, those incremental needs and have an open discussion. But nothing, of course, prevents you from going to the market and see what's out there, see what's new. There's, treasury conferences enough out there. Vendors are always keen to do a demo. Nothing stops you from exploring the market from time to time and see what you're missing.
Okay, and therefore re-entering into this cycle where you start with, okay, that's where I am today, but that's now what kind of needs I've identified into my treasury department, and potentially after having those demos, going into an RFP process and so on.
Exactly.
Very clear. How about we finish on, because here I think we can ask this question, what defines a successful system implementation?
To me, a successful system implementation is achieved if you basically, in the very beginning of your project, define, your, let's say, guiding principles, your objectives. What do you want to achieve as an organization? And it can be pretty broad and abstract, right? We want to automate X% of whatever. I think evaluating your final product against your objectives, against your requirements, is an important one. What we see also a lot of corporations do is regularly run satisfaction surveys, not only about the job content and how people are, of course, feeling within the organization, but also about the tools. And I think that's also very helpful to do from time to time. So that all defines your, whether your implementation was successful. But I think if you manage to implement, let's say 95% of your scope, and you had to give in on a number of items, but still, I mean, the large majority of what you want to achieve is achieved, then I think that could be kind of defined as a successful implementation. But in my view, you should always look to maintain your application, optimize it, think with the vendor about future state. That's only when, after 5 years, you will still be, happy with your application. Otherwise, if you do nothing and you let it go, it could be that you think it's not good anymore, but you actually not looked into it too much yourself.
Okay, so it's not only the implementation process that matter, but also how you follow up and maintain your system once it's live, implemented, and you want to incrementally improve it.
In my view, it is, yeah.
Super clear. And I guess the whole shabam is also linked to the roadmap that you mentioned earlier. And road mapping is key, important, and you want the go-live dates to be aligned with the actual go-live dates that's were written on paper and happening in reality.
Yeah, exactly, and that's a collaborative, thing. And so that needs to happen in conjunction or in cooperation with the system vendor, of course, the corporation itself, the client itself. It needs to be well understood. Everybody needs to be behind the plan, and also bought into the plan, right? That we're all behind to execute it in time. So that I think is essential to meet milestones and not kind of be left with a disappointment that you're still not live after 2 years or so.
Absolutely. Okay. Wow, that was a piece. Thanks a lot, Koen. Anything else you would like to add on the either implementation or the broader topic of treasury systems and systems in treasury landscape?
Well, maybe something on digital as a last point is that, of course, the tool set that we saw 15 years ago is much broader right now, right? So it's not only more about core systems like a treasury management system, a payment factory, and those specialist systems that I mentioned, but you also have broader tool sets available now to do something, and that should not necessarily be that complex. For example, robotics process automation, which is basically automating manual repetitive tasks, is basically a piece of software that runs on top of treasury management systems or other solutions. I mean, there's a bigger toolbox out there that people need to evaluate when thinking about a solution. It's not necessarily always doing a 12-month project to solve a problem. I think taking a step, trying something, proof of concepting something is essential these days to be fast and agile in the market.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Koen.